Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting lesson. We're going to begin here, as we always do, with our large square-headed brush in the sky. I covered the sky with a titanium white, and now I'm going back to my palette, grabbing a primary blue, applying that to the top of the sky, and blending it downwards softly. The goal here is to render a smooth gradient void of brush strokes. Then I'm going to go and grab a small, round-headed brush and some titanium white paint. I'm applying a sun to the center of our sky, then I'm going back, grabbing some additional paint, and beginning to apply clouds on both sides, kind of framing it. Now, these clouds are going to blend with the blue which we just used because it is still wet, but that is just fine. In fact, it's ideal. Because we're working in the background, I don't want a lot of contrast. I want to save all of that for our foreground. So right now, the subtlety of the clouds is just right. Now I'm going to just kind of touch that up and switch over to my larger square-headed brush. Here I'm going to be using a mixture of primary blue and a tiny bit of titanium white. I want the back of my water to be the darkest. Now, as you can see, I'm applying this in the same way I did the sky. However, my brush is rotated. I'm using the finer, smaller edge of the brush as opposed to the large, flat head of it. And I'm doing this so that we can kind of render implied waves in the distance. As I move closer to us in the foreground, I'm incorporating more titanium white paint and blending the two together. However, it's not an even blend. It's a blend made up of a myriad of brush strokes, as you can see here. We can see highlighted areas, we can see darker areas, but in total, progressively, it should get lighter as we move closer to us and the main subject, our beach. Speaking of our beach, I'm now applying a lot of burnt umber down here at the bottom of our canvas. Then I'm going to grab a lot of titanium white paint, apply that to the top of it, and begin to blend it down fairly softly yet again. However, I do want the back of the painting, or rather the area we're closest to be the darkest. So I'm kind of leaving that burnt umber a little bit less blended, where the sand closest to the water is going to be much more bright and full of light, as you can see here. It's a very subtle difference, but it does make a difference. Now, from there, I'm actually going to go back to my palette, grab a lot of titanium white, good amount of primary blue, and a very small amount of primary yellow. This is going to render a bit of green, and I'm going to begin blending the sand into the water. I want it to progressively move from one to the other, because as the water gets closer to the land, it becomes much more transparent, much more see-through, and so we should get a gradient from the brown of the sand into the blue of the water. I'm also applying a couple of highlights with titanium white, as you can see, creating some sharper waves washing up on the shore, and it's important that the edge of it, the area that's facing the sand, is very sharp, where the back of it kind of blends into the water. This will give it a much more realistic aesthetic. It's also important to note that you should make them in varying sizes, and that the middle of them will generally be a bit thicker, while the edges taper out and become much smaller. Now, from there, I'm going to switch over to my smaller square-headed brush, and I'm going to begin working on our trees. More specifically, the underlayer of our trees. Once this is dry and fully applied, we will add in our highlights and midtones. However, we need something to build on top of. So we're essentially using a very dark brown silhouette right now. As always, our trees should progress upwards and get smaller and smaller. No two branches should be the same. And if you're finding that you're having issues that the brown is blending with the white or blue of the background, just wait 5 minutes for the background to fully dry. I don't have that opportunity here because this is a 10-minute painting, but it will help the process if you have the time. Now, it's also worth noting that if you're using the smaller square-headed brush like this, and you're finding that you're getting a bit of a toothy aesthetic, that you're not getting that smooth, sharp edge that it should be rendering, I would simply implore you to incorporate more water. That will allow you to make thinner strokes and they'll be more precise. They won't have that grainy effect. However, if you add too much water, it'll become transparent. So you need to find that happy medium, and that's simply best achieved through trial and error, much like is most of painting. Now there, as you can see, we didn't do all of the branches, but that's because a lot of them are going to be covered up by foliage, and I'm not too worried about that right now. So I'm going to take that same brush, get a mixture of our burnt umber and titanium white, and I'm going to begin applying the highlights to the edges of the trees. And I'm doing this in a bit of a tapping motion. It's not one long stroke. And I'm doing it in a tapping motion so I can A, create a little bit of texture, and B, create a pattern, one that's almost reminiscent of a bark. So when you're applying these things, you're not just trying to render a light to medium to dark, you're also trying to interject some texture in there. And the combination of the two will really ensure that your subjects look the way that they're supposed to. As you can see, we're moving over to the other tree, and if you find that the pigments are blending a little bit too much, again, I'd simply implore you to wait a little bit of additional time, and you should be able to remedy that fairly easily, as they won't blend together as much. However, it is worth noting that acrylic paints are innately fairly transparent, so you will get a blend to a point. It's not a blend in the conventional sense of the paints are combining, but they're optically combining because you can see through one into the other, and then the colors mix like that. Now, from there, I'm actually taking an old square-headed brush, one where the bristles kind of leaf off in varying directions, so when you make a tapping motion with it, you render a litany of implications. And I'm doing exactly that. I'm using this tapping motion with a green that I've mixed. It's simply a mixture of a primary yellow and a primary blue, predominantly primary blue, and a little bit of Mars black. I'm also creating some bushes and foliage down here at the bottom, and much like our tree, we are just starting by building a base layer. We will add in the highlights a little bit later on. Now, this is great because it's kind of framing our beach scene here, and it will act as a nice vignette. Vignettes are a very effective tool to use in painting because they ensure that the viewer's eye subconsciously stays where you want it to. You see, the eye will innately, subconsciously go to the brightest portion of a painting, of a picture, and if you have the corners extremely bright, the eye can kind of go up there and then wander off of the painting onto the wall or onto something else entirely. And that's not what you want. You want to ensure that the viewer's eye stays in your painting, on your subject, for as long as possible. And that's best achieved when the edges and the borders are a little bit darker, because again, subconsciously, it's going to ensure that their eye stays where you want it. Now you can incorporate vignettes in a number of different ways. You can make the edges of the sky just a darker shade of blue, or you can incorporate another additional subject like the trees here, and by doing that we can make the edges substantially darker, really ensuring that the center of the painting is the brightest and the most captivating area. Now, from there, I'm also adding highlights onto the trees. I had the dark base, and then I added a middle tone, then I added a light tone. The middle tone was a mixture of the green, which was, primary yellow and primary blue, and the highlight was a lot of primary yellow, a little bit of primary blue, and a bit of titanium white. Through that, we create a light, a medium, and a dark part of our subject, which renders depth, because depth is determined in painting by how light wraps around your subject. So that's exactly what we did there. Now I'm taking a little bit of a wash of green and I'm applying that to our water. I'm doing this to ensure that the water is cohesive with the green in the trees and the leaves. I didn't want them to look like they were part of separate paintings, and generally the best way to connect things is to interject some of the color. Now, it's worth noting that this is what it looks like at the 10-minute mark, but I did have a couple of extra ideas. I did want to share them with you, so I hope you'll forgive me. I did cheat. I took an extra minute and a half, but I think it will be great for your learning process. So here to begin, I'm throwing in a couple of little trees over to the left. And I did this to add a little bit of additional intricacy, a little bit of additional interest. Because while the framing duality of the trees is great, they probably aren't going to grow like that, and to add back a little bit of realism, we need to balance it a little bit differently. We need to throw in something else that looks a little bit more natural, and that's what the addition of these does. Then I switch over to my old square-headed brush, and I apply some shimmering water here at the edge of the waves that are coming up on the land. I'm doing this with a tapping motion and some titanium white paint. I'm being very delicate with this, and I'm predominantly doing it with the waves in the real foreground that are just now washing up. But with that being said, there is our 10 to 11-ish minute painting. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section down below. I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. If you'd just like to learn more about acrylic painting in general, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. And if you'd like longer lessons, hour-long painting tutorials where I show you my palette, how we blend and mix colors, there is a link in the description to my Patreon as well, where you can find all of those. With that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful week, and as always, stay creative.